Hello and welcome to episode 50 of the Truuman Podcast, the podcast designed to create a generation of self-defined men. Today, I'm joined by James Hawes. James, it's an absolute pleasure. How are you doing today?
Brilliant. Thank you, Lewis, and thanks for having me on your show.
It's going to be a very good one. We had a conversation before, so I'm excited for this one a lot. But as always, James, in your own words, what makes you a man?
It's a brilliant question, isn't it? What makes me a man? Well, I do find that a pretty difficult question to answer, apart from, well, I've got the biology, I'd say. But I think what I like about myself as being a man is that I'm interested in growth. Interested in evolving and changing. And I suppose the key things for me are kind of taking responsibility for my emotions, my language, and my behavior.
Amazing. It's a great question to ask. I think we'll get onto this, but it's something that I feel should be asked relatively regular. I think it's a question that is always changing, but sometimes it's never asked at all. But having said that, James, why don't you tell us a little bit about who it is you are, what you do, and basically why I invited you here in the first place.
Okay, yes. So I practice as a counsellor and psychotherapist. I've been doing that for the last 20 odd years. And I specialise in working with boys and men. I've really taken an interest in trying to help and boys and men to become more emotionally fit, I'd say. That's kind of what I'm interested in terms of being able to express a broader range of emotions. So I practice privately. I've worked in schools for many years, working mainly with boys. I also train and lead workshops for other therapists around issues around men, such as anger, shame, and intimacy. And I've also authored a book called The Secret Lives of Men.
Amazing. So I'm excited to get into both sides of that, but I really want to start with something that's started to interest me specifically, which is boys. Why do boys struggle to have conversations around emotion?
Well, I would say it's the kind of environment that we've been brought up in as boys. I often say I've got a couple of sons myself, and I noticed a real difference when my son, 5, 6 years old, went to school. He basically had to learn very quickly that it's not okay, it's not safe to express a broad range of emotions, and basically the vulnerable emotions. So if he fell over on the playground, he's clearly hurt. He learned pretty quickly that I shouldn't show pain. I shouldn't cry, because if he did, he was going to be kind of slaughtered with words like, sissy, girl, crybaby, all of those kind of shaming kind of that language. So I think until we actually kind of allow, I suppose, boys to be in touch with the full spectrum of their emotions, it's going to be difficult for them to lean into those more vulnerable emotions.
Do you think it is purely societal, so the sense of being called names on the playground, potentially not getting into groups of other men, or do you think there is a biological side to it as well?
The position I take, I don't think there is any biological side to it. I think, we are human. We have access to all emotions. I think it's the way we've generally been nurtured. The modeling that we've had, so many boys and many of the men that I work with would have had fathers who are kind of emotionally kind of shut down. They don't express a broad range of emotions, mainly anger. And I suppose in terms of our peer groups, what we learned very quickly is that the way to kind of behave is let's be kind of negative or cruel to one another through the kind of classic banter. Let's put each other down. So that creates this sense of armor that we need to kind of look after ourselves. And so it becomes almost terrifying and very risky to be able to express some of those more vulnerable emotions.
Yeah, it's. I agree. Schools were cruel places. Now, I guess the flip side of that is there's an argument for the decrease in, shall we say, banter and those side of things, and what that's sort of doing for some people. Some people may say that it's good to have a well-rounded education, shall we say, in the sense that you take part in banter and you essentially, without beating around the bush, it's light bullying and potentially in some cases a bit worse. But for this scenario, we're talking about purely the banter amongst friends. So what's the difference? What's your view on that? Because some people may say that we're already becoming softer, we're already becoming more feminine like, or embracing feminine energy, whereas some people say that we need more of what there was. So what's your take on that stance of, I guess, media portraying the upbringing of boys right now?
I mean, it seems to me, I mean, I've been around a few years now, that that when there's a kind of movement, a shift towards men, kind of have had all these kind of ages of new man, the metrosexual, the spornosexual, all these kind of ways of men maybe expressing themselves in different ways. And every time one of these movements happen, and some people would say it's the softening, the feminization of men, there's been a massive backlash, and it happens almost every kind of 10 years. Almost like it's too scary for some in society to allow men to fully express emotions. Like they're going to be softened up. They're going to become kind of little puppies and be bossed and bullied around. Rather than the kind of holding this, all these dimensions of our character and our ability, our personality to say, well, look, expressing a vulnerable emotion, and I think even expressing kind of courage, that's a some people say that's a strong emotion, but it takes a lot of energy. Actually, kind of connects us with all sorts of parts of ourselves. So my view about feelings is that if we lean into feelings, we have more control of those feelings, not less. So those who say, we just need to be tough and strong and stick with the kind of anger spectrum or those kind of emotions, those people are kind of, I think, can become quite fragile because we're not kind of lent into the other, which I think is sometimes more difficult feelings of either anxiety, sadness, shame, hurt, disappointment, all those kind of feelings.
It's an interesting view on it. I believe that we should be talking about emotions and talking about those side of things. I think one thing that you can clarify this, but one thing that I think is you're trying to say is that everything that a man does is essentially an emotion. So whether it's anger or whether it's crying, it's not about not being angry and not crying. It's about understanding those emotions and dealing with those, I guess, in a more cohesive way, or a way that is less destructive to yourself or those around you. Is that fair?
Yes. Well, look, I talk a lot about emotional fitness. So how to effectively exercise our emotions, how to build emotional muscle. So in terms of if we've only developed one emotion, let's call that emotion, which I often talk about with men, is that anger is their default emotion. It's the kind of the big boy on the block. It's the one that's been acceptable in all its forms. Now, if we just, if we went to the physical gym and just worked on one bicep, it's going to be we're going to look a little bit weird, so if we've got all these other emotional muscles just wanting to be worked a bit, and they all work in unison. So yes, I need anger. I've not got a problem with anger at all. Anger is a fine, healthy emotion, as is anxiety, as is sadness, as is shame, as is happiness, and all the others. But if we are just relying on a small amount of our emotions, we're going to kind of be a little bit lopsided in some ways. So for me, leaning into anger in its kind of all of its depth and its health is really important. And I don't think we do that enough even. But so for me, it's like, let's use that word balance. But if we're going to be emotionally fit, we need to exercise the whole spectrum of emotions.
Okay, so it's more a case of understanding that. And I guess one thing that we talked about before, which is maybe sort of ties into this, is when I was at school and sort of that I guess that sexual education side of things, where you were learning about turning into a quote unquote man, shall we say, in regards to the change and things that were happening to you. But there was, I guess for me, there was no real especially with the stuff that I'm learning now, there was no real conversation around testosterone and what an increase in testosterone does and what a decrease in testosterone does. And essentially, from your side of that, that's going to lead to certain emotions, whether that's sadness, anger, anxiety, all based on these things. And I personally feel that that is something that's missing. Whereas if you were to look at the female side of it, my understanding is that their conversations are a lot more in depth because there's actually quite a large change going on in regards to them. So what's your, do you feel that that's missing for boys, or is there something else that's missing for boys?
Go on, sorry, say that again. What am I trying to answer here, and in terms of what's missing?
Yeah, in regards to, is it just emotion, or do you feel like emotional intelligence, or do you feel that there's more that needs to be done with boys, essentially?
Oh, okay, yes. So, I think you were kind of touching a little bit on that really powerful kind of transition around kind of puberty and the massive changes that can happen there for females and for males. I think you're right. We do need to help assist boys and girls through these massive transitions. As I would say, we do continually through our life. There's different transitions which maybe we need to offer assistance on. So, the issue, I suppose, classically, there are these rites of passage programs, and there's some really modern programs that are happening in school at the moment, and I think they're really interesting, where they're kind of trying to work with, let's just focus on boys, and kind of working out, well, kind of what are their values, what are our beliefs, what is it, as to be a man, what does it mean to be a man. So to dive into these, I think, is really important, as compared to perhaps to some of the old rites of passages from before, where they were generally, I think, kind of quite brutal, physically brutal. I don't think we need those, but I think it will be helpful for boys to kind of have this information, have this education.
Yeah, I wasn't. Yeah, not talking about let's release the boys into the field and see what happens. But yeah, well, it's interesting that there's stuff happening. I wasn't fully aware. I need to do a little bit more into it. But I feel that for me personally, it was definitely something. Looking back in hindsight, and all the stuff that I do now is something I felt was missing. Let's talk about some of the practices. So we know it's needed, and we know that boys and men need to sort of embrace their emotions. But say someone's listening and they go, actually, yeah, most of the time, all I deal with is anger. What are some of the things that they can put into place to start to develop that emotional intelligence?
Okay, so if they are particularly struggling with anger, I often ask and work with men to kind of let's focus in on that anger, and in terms of when does it come out, how does it come out, how is it expressed, and I would often say, and I think this is a really good practice, of keeping a kind of anger log. An anger journal, if you like. So that would give us information, would give us data on the time where they find themselves getting angry, the trigger, the kind of outcome, how long it takes them to kind of calm down or move on. And so that idea of kind of keeping a log, focusing in on it, becoming aware of it, is really, really important. And I think I think often there are certain triggers. And if we understand the triggers, then we can kind of start to move into understanding maybe other emotions that may have been connected with anger in that moment.
Yeah, it's okay. That's an interesting way of dealing with it. Is essentially writing it down, seeing where you trigger yourself, and then making changes from that. I think one thing that I sort of want to talk about is we talked briefly on the boyhood to manhood, and I think this sort of ties into what we've just touched on, which is I personally only felt like I was a man a few years ago, and we've talked about on the podcast different transitions of where people see that. But for me, I think that emotional intelligence or that vulnerability was something that allowed me to accept that. I think I was going through just the motions of society, what it means to be a man, and when that all broke down and all failed, I was just left as the boy I always was because there wasn't anything else there. So, well, going back to that boyhood to manhood, do you think that can happen at any stage?
Yes, I think you're right. For me, I mean, equally, I felt very much, and I've heard this a lot from some of the men I've worked with. The boy part of us is kind of dominates. It's almost like the idea, the insecurity or the fragility, the not knowingness that kind of dominates men in adulthood. I think that I think often that's where, as you kind of said, the kind of these feelings, being who we are, being happy with being who we are, that we don't have to fit into some kind of way of being a man, is a real, as it were, coming of age. It's a sense of equally for me, I probably didn't feel that I really kind of felt safe in my skin or in my manhood, as it were, until probably mid-30s. And I think that was because the boy was still dominating me.
Yeah, well, I've spoken a number of times in regards to what that change used to look like. And I think looking back and looking at like my dad's friends and their, let's say, midlife and I guess midlife crisis, it was buying more toys, right? It was buying a boat or buying a Porsche. It wasn't embracing vulnerability and having a conversation about who am I? What do I want to do? Why do you think those conversations are more regular now?
I think maybe they are more regular now because perhaps the idea of a bit like that you're talking there about the classic kind of midlife crisis, the idea where there's a massive transition, and I think that's the kind of that liminal space between the first and second half of life. And lots of men get stuck in the first half of life, i.e., let's just go back to our youth. Let's buy more toys. Let's get a sports car that we can hardly get down into, or a motorbike and stuff like that. And because it's a bit like I don't want to let go of my youth. I still want to be, seen as this virile young lad. Instead of the second half of life for me is very much it's going inwards. And that's scary for a lot of men. If we haven't done that work, then it's scary. Now, I do think what I notice, there's a lot more men now who are actively, well, they can't avoid it. They can't avoid because many men may have all the toys already. There's nothing else to do. So the idea of, okay, what is this next stage of my life going to look like? And can I take the courage to move into inside ultimately and drop the ego? I don't need to keep looking after that side of me anymore, but I can actually go deeper into myself. And I think that's where when we can move into and become more familiar and comfortable with that full spectrum of emotions, that's where a massive kind of growth explosion can happen.
Yeah, for sure. I like we've almost completed consumerism. Everyone's already got everything anyway, so there's no point in buying anymore. So you might as well find yourself in your 30s and 40s. I like that. I did a podcast a while ago with a guy by the name of Ryan Park. Well worth listening to if you've not already. But part of that, we were talking about testosterone and alphas, and one thing that I found really interesting was in the form of apes and their traditional alpha, which is not what maybe is perceived as an alpha in our society, or what social media is perceiving it as in our society. He was talking a lot about how the alpha is known to groom other members, is known to give gifts to other members of the pack, but is always the first port of call when there's something going wrong, or there's an attack on their tribe. Whereas the other side of that is the aggression, which is what's typically seen as an alpha male. And he said that they tested this, and they basically pumped a chimp full of testosterone and rose it up to basically become aggressive. And it got to a point where they killed that chimp, and the other alpha stayed as the alpha, because that short-term burst of just I'm the best, I'm the best, I'm the best wasn't sustainable for the tribe as a whole, or the pack, whatever the terminology is for monkeys. Now, the reason that I bring that up is because you talk about inner work and that side of things, and having those, I guess, relationships as you grow older. What benefits have you seen from the work that you do, but also men who have, let's just, significantly greater emotional intelligence? What does that mean for their relationships?
I think once some men are doing that work in around emotions, I think they're able to develop relationships a lot in deeper ways. I think we won't get relational growth either with our partners or with friends if we haven't done some of this work in terms of emotions. And for me, where we're in a society where generally we're often hearing about men who are lonely, they're isolated, they've not got many friends. And so when we do this work, we're going to absolutely lean a lot more into making more contacts. And ultimately, the other thing is intimacy, that we can become more intimate, psychologically intimate with others, which gives us a real connection to them. So for me, that's the massive bonus, that we will ultimately feel a lot more connected with others.
What is your views on male loneliness? Is there something that you think is missing for, let's say, men, because it primarily is men, it's not really boys, I guess. Is there something that's missing from their lives additionally to emotional intelligence?
I think, see, my view is that most of us as boys and men, one of the legacies that we've learned, often from our fathers or from other males, is self-reliance. So what we've learned through men, older men, not being able to express a full range of emotions, not being in touch with maybe their body, not being intimate, not being vulnerable, is what we learn is that, okay, what men are self-reliant. They don't need anyone else. It's that old kind of concept of the strong, silent type, that man who can go away and live in the woods for ever, and he just needs himself or look after himself. Now, if we're self-reliance, to me, is, of course, many of us would want to be kind of self-reliant. But when we kind of go to uber self-reliance, it ultimately moves us away from other people. So when we can kind of unlearn that and really, and I've spoken to many men thinking, a lot of men will say, well, I don't need other people. And when they're honest with themselves, they're absolutely, I do need people. And so I think those old tools, those old ways of being are devastating for men.
Why do you think we can be self-reliant? Where do you think that's come from? Because it's interesting, right? Doesn't make much sense.
Well, I think it's, my view is, I think it's because we have little education in terms of moving into leaning into our vulnerable, some people say softer emotions, and when we do, we kind of start accessing a sense of, actually, I do want to be close to other people. But it's scary. I think it's
Yeah.
absolutely terrifying, because that means that I need to trust other people, that they will look after me, that they will keep me safe. And of course, if we go back to the banter story, what we learn about banter is that actually this isn't safe. This is a game we're playing. At any time, I could be under emotional or physical attack. And so it's not safe. So I keep my armor up. And so boys and men have to learn that, okay, it's safe enough to bring some of this armor, the shuttering down, if you like, to be able, dare I trust this other person with my inside feelings, my vulnerability. And of course, when men do, and men are quite capable of this, I've seen it, you've seen it individually and with groups of men, that men just want to connect in another way. They're eager for it.
Yeah, well, there's always the joke, isn't there, of how easy men make friends. But I was going to ask you on that, because a lot of those are surface level, right? So, for example, you join a golf club, you play with three people, you would arguably count those as your friends for that. I mean, a lot of men, it takes a lot of men to maybe get to that stage, but the ease in which men make friends or acquaintances is quite easy. But do you think there's a problem with surface level, or do you think that's suffice?
Well, it's interesting you say the ease, because I'm not sure if it is that easy for men to make friends. There's some facts and figures out there saying for men over 35, they find it very difficult to make friends. Now, what you're talking about, I think, which is really interesting, is traditionally the way that men have made friends is through sport, through
Yeah.
activity, doing something together. So, I've worked with some professional sportsmen, footballers and stuff. So look, what happens is when that man is injured, when they leave the team, they're not part of the team anymore, they then quickly become quite isolated and possibly depressed, because when they're not riding on a bike, playing golf or whatever, or kicking a ball, they
Yeah.
those guys are not checking in on them. They're kind of, that's it, mate, you're done. If you can't turn up to the five-a-side, we probably won't see you again. Or the other course is, let's go down the pub and have a beer, and that's another way of men. But again, you've got to want to drink. I mean, it's fortunately easier now with zero alcohol and stuff like that. So I think it's created around activities, and that's, I think, when men struggle. That how do we make friends if we don't have an activity to kind of connect with?
Yeah, I mean, the flip side of that is friends of partners, right? And then if that relationship breaks down, all of a
Yep.
sudden you don't have any friends because they were actually your wife's friends or your partner's friends, and that's gone as well. What I was saying with ease is that usually you see they'll talk, they find some common ground quite quickly, and they'll try and get on. I think the other side of that is people who find it really hard when people don't like football. So like, oh, what team do you support? And the other guy goes, well, I don't like football. Then they're panicking because they've got no common ground with them. But that's more on them than the person who doesn't like football, in my opinion. But yeah, it's interesting, because it's like, where do men make meaningful relationships then?
Well, I
Um,
think,
like,
I think they can, in terms of, even in all the things that we've said, of course, in sport and in going down the pub. I'm not going to say that there aren't some meaningful relationships here, but I
yeah,
think it does take a lot for men to kind of lean into that other part. So I often tell the story, and I kind of know this to be true, that men can spend best mates for 25 years. Every weekend they're playing football, watching football, under the bonnet of a car, doing something. And they've never said to each other, do you know what, Jim, I really like you. Or I might even say, I love you. I mean, it's never said. So they probably
yeah,
know it. I'm sure he does. But because it's never said, there's always this question, this vulnerability, because it's never spoken. So our relationships are absolutely can be deep and connected and meaningful. But I think when we don't say it, it's a bit like, how many times have I heard a adult son tell me that he's never heard his father tell him that he loves him, that he's
yeah,
proud of him. Never heard it. He might hear it from his mum saying, your dad loves you, don't you? But he's never heard it. So this is kind of left, and I think that prevents men moving into deeper connectedness.
So you have sons yourself.
Yep.
How do you? I mean, obviously, the answer is just say it. But how do you get to a point where you can have those conversations with your sons?
Well, I mean, I think I've written a book, and that's kind of given this book to my sons. Like, this is me. There's lots of stuff in here that you need to read, that kind of stuff. But I don't think both of them. One of them has read it, I think. But I need to practice that, and even if my son may not be ready to hear that, to be, Dad, don't give me all that sloppy stuff or whatever. I still want to say it, and I practice it. I miss you. I love you. I care for you. I want to show that, whether that's a text, whether that's verbally by being with them, by hugging them, all of this kind of stuff. I'm going to do, even though they may get off, I'm going to at least offer, and say, I'm here, and I want to show you that I care for you and I love you and I'm thinking of you.
Practice is a great word that you probably use a lot in what you do, right? As men, we tend to be perfectionists, maybe, probably guilty as charged. But maybe that's another reason why we find this hard, is that it's a practice, right? You've got to keep doing it. No one's going to be perfect. No one's the best at emotions.
No, totally right. And I think you're right. And we even, whatever, if we're heterosexual, homosexual, we still have to practice saying these words. Men classically struggle to even say I love you. It's like, I'll show you that I love you. I won't say it, but saying it, texting it. I mean, these are very small things, really, but very difficult things for some of us to say. Even to the people we would say, we love them, but we don't say it enough. So that idea of diving into that kind of intimacy, allowing the other to know, even if they can't reciprocate, being able to say, this is what I like doing. And it's a vulnerable thing to say, I love you, to offer a hug. And these are vulnerabilities that many of us don't want to expose ourselves to.
Yeah, that was going to be my sort of follow-on question to that, is like, I imagine a lot of men are like, well, who says it first? And it's like, but I guess for listeners and sort of on that, the more that I've been in this space and the more that I talk about me and I talk about my journey, the more people are willing to open up to me. And I probably don't say I love you to my friends, or I don't show vulnerability with them as much as I could or want to, maybe. And it goes back to that practice thing, and no one's ever going to be perfect at this. But that would be my sort of call to arms, if you will, is if you start to do baby steps, see how they're receptive. Is that a fair assumption?
Totally. That's exactly it. To practice, and you start saying it, doing it, whatever you need. And I think it's contagious. I recently set up a men's dinner club in Nottingham, where I come from. And these men, never met them before. And one man just within an hour, men were talking really deeply about themselves, saying some incredibly vulnerable things. I was blown away by this. And at the end, they were all wanting to hug each other, thinking, this is incredible. Just create a little space. We're having to meet dinner. Then we're asking, we're having about an hour where we kind of dive into, I have a few little, what I call man deck questions on them, a bit more intimate for them to talk about. And it's just flowing, and there is care and love and empathy. Yeah, absolutely perfect.
I think that's something that's really important as well, is finding the right environment. Maybe the golf course or the pub isn't necessarily the perfect place to do it to start with. You've got to create the environment.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting, because I've been having conversations with one of my clients, young man, who's really wanting to lean into this, and It's interestingly, he does it. He has done it on the golf course, and he has done it at the pub. He has, he's just kind of asked his friends who he kind of get drinking with, just banging a different, kind of deeper question, and it's just that trial and see what the comeback is, and if you're fairly safe with this stuff. If they don't go for it, there's no harm. There's nothing missed. They're not going to generally. I've never heard anybody say, "Oh my God, what's happened to him?" They're just think most of them would kind of move into that space. I think.
Do you think there's a air of jealousy for men who? Because you said earlier that people want to be vulnerable, men want to be vulnerable, and they do it. Do you think there's an air of jealousy for men who can't do it, and that is that where their banter comes from, or their defensive towards it comes from?
I'm not sure about jealousy. I've never thought about it in those terms before. I think it's more fear. I mean, I have been in one of these places in a pub where someone's mentioned let's talk about something else, and men have said, no, I don't do that. I can't do that. So I think it's more about fear, about it's, I do think feelings are terrifying for some men.
So that's in that scenario where you're the person having the conversation. I meant more for men that are outside of those spaces that they want to be first but can't. I don't know, but yeah, it's an interesting. Fear is probably more realistic than jealousy.
I mean, I think in terms of jealousy, they may be maybe more admiring this other man who's more open and able to talk about himself. They may admire that. I would find it interesting if it was a more kind of unhealthy emotion that they were feeling. I would think it would be more of a positive one. I want some of that, but I'm really struggling to get that.
Yeah, no, I hope it is the latter rather than the former for sure. In regards to the men's space as a whole, I think it's safe to say that it's come on leaps and bounds, even in the short time I've been in this space. Obviously yourself, you've been in it a little bit longer. What are you seeing right now that you're really hopeful for, or something that you're seeing right now that's really, really working for men and boys?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. And I've noticed, I suppose, in the last 5 to 10 years, there's so much going on for men. So many men's groups are popping up, walking and talking, around sports everywhere. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. There's massive amount of opportunity, massive amount of people involved in men's groups, men involved in all sorts of areas in terms of business, mental health space, and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's a really positive. Men are talking about it. Men are, there's so many more men, young men, older men, who are absolutely wanting to kind of go further and to grow.
It's yes, I'm also extremely happy with how much there is, and also variety, right? I think it was very, very linear originally, and now there's so many options, from sheds to football to walking to cooking to deep dive conversations. There's lots of varied options, which is amazing. What about for boys and that side of thing? What are you hopeful for in regards to the next generation of men?
Well, in my work with boys in schools, I definitely have seen a shift in more boys becoming more open and connected. So I worked as a counsellor in school, a boys' school. Lots of boys were coming for individual therapy. There was, yes, a bit of a stigma, but that stigma has definitely got less. So I think there is a shift. There is a movement. Whenever I see young boys and men kind of connected with themselves and openly talking, it's so lovely and a beautiful thing to see. So however, I still think there is a lot of resistance. Again, in those same schools, I hear of bullying, of unhealthy banter, isolation, but boys struggling with physical and mental health issues. So we've got a long way to go, but I think there is hopefulness there.
Yeah, it's it's so interesting. It's so interesting with boys. I'm I'm envious of you being in that space. I think it's something that I really personally want to sort of explore a little bit more. Is just not shaping, but
Mm,
providing tools and equipping
mm,
the men of the future for sure. I
mm.
think there's a lot that can be done there. So hats off to you for sure. And yeah, I'm again also really hopeful. James, it's been an absolute pleasure. I genuinely could talk to you for hours and hours and hours around many topics, but I will let people know where you are, how to
Yeah.
find you, and anything else that you want to sort of finish off with.
Great, thanks, Lewis. Yeah, and that's been brilliant talking to you as well. I love these conversations. Here we are, two men talking about some pretty deep stuff, and I love seeing you as well. A younger man, clearly than me, who's kind of investigating and investing himself into this. So that's great. I would just say, in terms of I'm based in Nottingham. I'm a psychotherapist. I've got a book, as I said, The Secret Lives of Men. You can get that off Amazon if you wish.
Amazing. Thank you for your time, James.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lewis.